happened a couple of weeks ago was an extraordinary failure of moral leadership. And I think it's given rise in the minds of many to serious questions for the first time about the character of this government. With hindsight, why did he and his right honourable friends not recognise the brazen wrongdoing of their colleague?
Well, that worked out well, didn't it? What an absolute and utter disaster. And to see the Leader of the House standing there, no apology, no contrition, no ability to let it sink in just how bad things have come. The last place that he wanted to be today was at that dispatch box, doing exactly the opposite and saying exactly everything that he didn't say 2 weeks ago when he presented that motion. And they were doing everything possible yesterday to get to 10 o'clock so this debate wouldn't be had, only to be told by the honourable member from Christchurch with the word of object to the malicious, malign attempt to undermine and smear our Standards Commissioner. Absolutely and utterly disgraceful. When we heard the Business Secretary last week saying that she should consider her position, she shouldn't be considering her position. The Leader of the House should be considering his position, as should the Prime Minister. It's because they needed to undermine the Standards Commissioner in order for the silly, stupid plan to work for them. And of course, it hasn't worked at all.
I just want to go over a couple of things. The idea of natural justice, I have to say, seems incredibly to be in the eye of the beholder. I find, as somebody who has worked in the justice sector for nearly 2 decades now, it's never something that's ever said about victims. Victims are never asking for natural justice, one notes. Natural justice is a terminology that always gets pulled out when people don't like the result of something that has happened, I find. And I have to say, I feel that what happened in this case was absolutely natural justice. The honourable gentleman, the Owen Patterson, was entitled all the way through to defend his case. And if what the Leader of the House said earlier about, you know, his mind was clouded by the tragedy that had occurred, you know, I have some sympathy for that, except it's not a mitigation that's ever offered to any of my constituents in immigration tribunals, in welfare tribunals, dreadful things that have happened to them that would never be taken into account. And so it's quite difficult when the government's policy is to mitigate only against some people and cloud their minds only against some people.
The government has not yet properly explained why it chose to whip that first vote and whether it plans to intervene in House business again. I have said it already, as have many colleagues, but Mr Speaker, standards proceedings belong to this House. The government has authority through its majority, but it does not have the power to make changes to our rules. At the end of the day, members of the government, like it or not, are members of this House, equal to those of us who sit on the backbenches in that regard. The government has not yet apologised or explained why it wanted rule changes. And, Mr Speaker, vague regrets for completing proceedings against an individual and the process more generally are not an apology. I know, as does any parent, that my children often regret doing something wrong when they get in trouble, but that is not the same as an apology for the action itself.
But would the honourable member agree that rather than the highly respected independent Commissioner for Standards resigning, as was mooted by ministers when they felt invincible, that rather than her resigning, it should be the Prime Minister who should be considering his position, given that he forced his Conservative MPs to vote to protect his paid lobbyist friend, rather than doing what is right, by thereby doing, he has egregiously eroded our democracy.
I'd not intended to speak in the debate, but I was prompted, I have to say, by the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, because it became incredibly apparent to me, and I suspect to members across this House, that had she been in charge, this chaos would never have happened. And this chaos is the making entirely of one person, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister. So when the Leader of the House comes to that dispatch box and says that actually the reason we made this mistake was because we had sympathy for Mr Patterson,
Not true.
It's not credible. Because what happened the very next day is that cabinet ministers were instructed by the chief whip or the Prime Minister to go out on the TV and defend it.
It is 3 weeks since the Standards Committee produced our report on the conduct of Owen Patterson. It detailed a catalogue of bad behaviour. The evidence was stark and compelling. He repeatedly engaged in paid lobbying. He peddled influence for his paying clients. He repeatedly used his parliamentary office to run a commercial enterprise. Every single MP I have spoken to who has read the report tells me he was guilty. And yet here we are. Mr. Speaker, I hope it is helpful if I say a few words about appeals. We on the committee have been grappling with this for some time, and I expect we will be able to say more when we report formally to the House before Christmas. We're in the process of appointing a senior judicial figure to help us think through all of these issues, as I told the House last week. It is wrong, however, to say, as several have, that there is no appeal process now. There is. A member can appeal the Commissioner's decision that there has been a breach of the rules. The Committee on Standards hears that appeal, with 7 lay independent members and 7 members of this House. Unlike most appeal bodies, we are remarkably generous. We do not specify grounds for appeal and effectively allow not just an appeal, but also a general rehashing of all the arguments. We can also hear an appeal in writing and in person, unlike most courts, and often a member chooses to do both, as Mr. Patterson did. The way the Government and the Prime Minister have handled this has been shameful, and it has brought the House into disrepute. It was just wrong to delay the original motion, wrong to change the rules at the last minute of a disciplinary process for a named individual, wrong to whip members on a standards report, wrong to call for the Commissioner to resign, wrong to refuse to table this motion last week, wrong to try and get away with just taking this motion last night without debate. Just plain wrong, 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 and the Government knows it.
Mr. Speaker, standards matter. Scrutiny matters. An independent system of holding everyone in public life to account matters. Standards should not be seen or treated as an irksome bother that you get your mates to change when you're found out. It should not be seen as something to be feared or something to be treated with such disdain, frankly incompetence and a total absence of leadership as we've seen from this sorry government over this sorry affair. Mr. Speaker, to anyone who really loves democracy, standards are the bedrock of everything we do, everything. Once more, it seems I have to remind the right honourable gentleman that they are, the Nolan principles are, selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and finally, leadership.